My sense is that he probably was sexually malfunctioned, malformed. All the indicators are that he is asexual, but he wanted to surround himself with eminent women.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Undone, Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment in history or a historical figure, and I'll sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the most common things that people get wrong, and we'll also cover one or two things you may not know. Today we are discussing Adolf Hitler, a figure who, perhaps unsurprisingly, is shrouded in myth. And joining me is the historian and author and History Undone regular Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Chris, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
For a figure so famous, infamous, why are there still so many myths around Adolf Hitler?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is the fact that he constantly reinvented his own past. I think today's perception of Nazi Germany by the public is still dominated by Nazi propaganda. And at the end of the war, everybody had a reason for saying one thing or another about Hitler and, of course, the regime. Some people want to excuse their behavior, others wanted to castigate it. I mean, the most notable example is the way in which all sorts of perversions are loaded onto Hitler just because he was an evil man. As we delve into it more deeply, you'll see that there's not a basis of much fact in any of this. And so we have to be really careful about the evidence that we use when we're assessing Hitler's character and his motivations.
That's really interesting. So sometimes it's just ignorance that perpetuates these myths. Sometimes it's ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to remember that quite a lot of people were being cited before various tribunals, and Nuremberg in particular, and wanted a narrative to supplant perhaps what really happened in order to get themselves out of a bit of a fix. The classic one is no U-boat commander, in fact, except one U-boat commander was saying anything bad about Admiral Dönitz, their previous boss, because they were concerned themselves that they might be in trouble with the Nuremberg authorities. So any evidence that we look at, we have to really treat with a bit of skepticism and really apply scholarship and logic to it. The classic thing, James, is Hitler's story about his life in the First World War. He said, that he was a heroic sort of messenger that went back and forth across the front line. But if you look at the letters and diaries of the people who served with him in the Bavarian List Regiment, he was actually at regimental headquarters. He was known as a rear area pig by his former colleagues. They said he was a loner. He wasn't really interested in the sort of things that they were interested in. But it became the basis, of course, of the Hitler myth that everything he believed in started from his time in the trenches. And indeed, of course, he got an Iron Cross First Class, which is a pretty significant medal for essentially what was a lance corporal at the time. Now, I think that was down to the fact that he was always around the senior officers, and it's significant that the person who recommended him for the Iron Cross First Class was the regimental adjutant. So that's back at headquarters. But even more significant is that the adjutant himself, Hugo Gutmann, was Jewish. And later on, when Gutmann was being investigated by the Gestapo, it was thought that Hitler got him out of the scrape with the Gestapo and the SS. In fact, recent research has proved that's not the case. It was his previous colleagues amongst the List Regiment, the Bavarian List Regiment, that actually got Gutmann off the hook and got him out into Belgium and then subsequently to the United States.
Well, let's get into some of the myths that we're going to explore in depth today. You've chosen 5 for us. The first one, I suppose you could argue, is one of the most controversial and damaging, potentially. It's the suggestion that Hitler has Jewish heritage. Where does this come from, Chris?
Yeah, the idea that Hitler, according to his own logic and the Nuremberg laws, was a quarter Jewish really dates back to the early days of when Hitler was on the rise, when quite a lot of his opponents in the extreme right-wing parties wanted to prevent him from coming to power. As Hitler's own father was illegitimate, there was this claim that Hitler had been fathered by the head of the Jewish household, for which Hitler's grandmother, Maria Anna, had worked for a while. However, there was a surreptitious DNA testing of Hitler's Austrian and American relatives that was carried out sometime in the 1980s by a Belgian journalist called Jean-Paul Mulders. And we now know certainly that the stepfather of Hitler's father was in fact his biological father, and therefore Hitler didn't have a Jewish grandfather. But what's really interesting about this is that Hitler himself was really worried about it. So he commissioned Hans Frank, who was his chief jurist under the Third Reich regime, to investigate the claim that Hitler had Jewish ancestry in 1930. And of course, they cleared him of any sort of taint of that, which of course was a taint in those days. So no, there's absolutely no evidence. In fact, there's positive evidence that he didn't have a Jewish grandfather.
That's fascinating. So Hitler himself dispelled that myth.
Well, in fact, Hans Frank, his chief jurist, dispelled it on his behalf.
On his behalf, yeah.
But later DNA testing proved that that wasn't the case.
And this links, Chris, to another question, which was the fact that this suggestion that his name wasn't Hitler but Schicklgruber.
Yeah, it would sound very strange, wouldn't it? Heil Schicklgruber. But again, it was never his name. As I said, Hitler's father had been born illegitimate to Maria Anna, obviously Hitler's grandmother, Schicklgruber, which is her maiden name. Yet he changed his name to Hitler, that's Hitler's father, to the name of his stepfather, who was, of course, his biological father. And that was well before Adolf Hitler was born. So Schicklgruber, I'm afraid, doesn't play.
But what is fascinating with this myth-busting series is that it's really intriguing and sometimes very concerning how certain myths are perpetuated even to the present day. And I mean, this myth about Hitler potentially having Jewish ancestry has been used recently by Sergei Lavrov, the current Russian foreign minister, as a way of justifying the war in Ukraine. Yeah,
well, Hitler suits people's agendas at different times in history, to tell you the truth. I mean, quite a lot of Hitler supporters in Britain in 1938-39, and we have to realise that every historic figure, I'm afraid, becomes a tool in the hand of people who want to portray certain narratives and agendas.
Well, let's come on to myth number 2 now. And this is something a little bit lighter, one that probably most people watching are aware of. And this is the question of Hitler's genitalia. Now, most people in Britain certainly will be aware of the old song, Hitler's Only Got One Ball. Where does that come from, Chris?
Yeah, it's very odd where this comes from. I think where it comes from is that Hitler essentially is heterosexual. There's evidence of him meeting homosexuals, and in Vienna when he was young, he recognized homosexuality when he saw it. And of course, the regime itself persecuted homosexuals quite severely. So he knew about that. There's evidence that when he was 10 years old, he witnessed sex between his father and his mother, and this kept on recurring in some of the drawings that he did. And people have said, well, this put him off sex for life. I mean, I think that's a bit Freudian, to tell you the truth. I think the best evidence we have is an indication from his early life where people indicated in medical records that he had a genital malfunction or malformation. And I think the current authority is that he had hypospadia, which is a birth defect. It's a congenital condition in which, and I'm sorry to be indelicate here, the opening of the urethra is on the underside of the penis rather than at the tip. And obviously that's quite embarrassing. Now, Hitler's valet said that when he was on duty at Berchtesgaden, he heard sort of orgasmic noises coming from inside of Hitler's bedroom. He wasn't sure whether that was related to anything. But again, he had been captured by Stalin and was being interrogated by the NKVD. So that might not be accurate. The fact of life is that Hitler can't be actually nailed down as having any real sexual relationship with any woman. He had a very odd relationship, almost an obsession with his half-sister's daughter, who was known as Geli Rabal. And he kept her in a flat in Munich until she actually killed herself. And nobody really knows why that was the case. But there's no indication that he kept her other than a pet, if you like. We know about Eva Braun, whom he married in the bunker just before he killed himself, and her. Eva Braun, on a number of occasions, said to people like her hairdresser, we never have sex. It never happens like that. But please don't tell anybody. And then there's another woman called Maria Reitel who claimed to have slept with Hitler on a one-night stand, but there's no evidence that that indeed happened, and she may have been doing that for profile. I mean, my sense is that he probably was sexually malformed. All the indicators are that he is asexual, but he wanted to surround himself with eminent women. All the way through the regime, you see him in the company of various women. He was very close to Winifred Wagner, for example, the granddaughter of the composer Bayreuth. And throughout, if you look at the newsreels, there's good-looking and sort of attractive women around him. So I think he was friendly, he liked their company, but very rarely intimate. He was always saying, in his writings and his sayings that, German men should actually have good sex because that leads to procreation on behalf of the Reich. But I think, this is what I think Hitler talked a good war with regard to sex here. He didn't actually get engaged in it.
But I suppose in a way you can understand why, certainly at the time, it would be beneficial to Hitler's opponents to perpetuate this myth. I mentioned that song, Hitler's only got one ball, the other's in the Albert Hall. That's how the lyrics go. If you're the Brits, it's a way of emasculating Hitler. It's
a very good point, yeah, James. Emasculating the other and all that sort of thing. But again, you see, because the man's evil, and of course he was evil, there's no doubt about that, people want to put all sorts of perversions onto him. But, I know people in my life, who are either asexual or they're sexually celibate. It happens. And certainly as the regime grew in power and his own power increased, you hear most of the time Hitler saying he's married to Germany, he's married to the cause. And that he clearly doesn't indicate what I call overt sexuality. And again, people speculate, but there's no evidence, to tell you the truth. And as much as we want him to be a sexual pervert, there really isn't much evidence.
And what part does the Soviet Union play in this, Chris? Because am I right in saying in 1970 they claimed that an autopsy had showed that he only had one testicle?
Yeah, well, that's going to be really interesting, isn't it? Because, we know what happens in the end. Hitler kills himself. He kills Eva Braun and his pet Alsatian Blondie. And essentially the bodies are taken up into the garden of the Chancellery, doused with petrol, and they're burnt. Now, the Russians got hold of a fragment of skull, and they got some teeth as well. They did some sort of tests on them, but for heaven's sake, if a body's been burnt and all you've got is bones and sort of teeth left, you're never going to discover whether the guy's got one testicle or not. I mean, that is just outrageous. I mean, the interesting thing is the piece of skull which they claimed was Hitler's skull turned out to be a woman between the ages of 20 to 40. Now, that's probably not Eva Braun because she died through cyanide poisoning, not through a shot. So it's some other woman who was in the Chancellery at the time, I suspect.
We will move on from Hitler's testicles in a moment, but why do you think this particular one doesn't go away, Chris? Is it because, frankly, we're human beings, we're a bit base sometimes, we find this kind of stuff fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain salaciousness to it, isn't there? And as I said, the connection between sexuality, power, and reputation is very close indeed. And I think people want to think some way Hitler was inadequate. Well, actually, we can give them that. He had this real problem with his penis. So, I think that's probably the best thing we can do. Whether he had one testicle or two is irrelevant. What's really interesting is that there was a story actually knocking around that he'd fathered a child when he was on World War I service. Quite extraordinary. That was debunked again by DNA testing well after the war. But what was really interesting is that all the way through the war, the family was paid by the Nazis for some reason. Whether there was a kindness extended to Hitler and his colleagues in World War I, we don't know. But it's very interesting that was the case.
And just finally on this, to go back to the old musical song of the 1930s, did the song come first, or were there already rumours about this beforehand?
Well, it's very interesting because it's something that was sung about the Kaiser as well in World War One. So Hitler inherited, I think, probably the same sort of thing about the Kaiser. So the music halls were talking about that then. So I think it's probably moved up a generation and been applied to Hitler as well.
Okay, let's come on to myth number 3 about Adolf Hitler. It's a really interesting one, this. It's the claim that a young Hitler visited Britain, Liverpool to be precise, in 1912. Tell us a bit more about this one, Chris.
Yeah, this relies on the memoirs essentially of his sister-in-law called Bridget Dowling, who basically lived in Liverpool, having come there from Ireland. So what happens here is the story begins with his half-brother Alois. And what's interesting about him is he had come to be, if you like, a guest worker, a migrant worker in Britain in 1909. He'd gone to Ireland where he'd met Bridget Dowling, his wife, but he had a bad reputation and he spent many years in prison for petty theft. Now, in Liverpool around 1911, you can see in the census that he's called Anton Hitler. And believe it or not, he worked at the Jewish-owned Lions Cafe in Toxteth, which is where he lived. And, you know, we even have his address, 102 Upper Stanhope Street in Toxteth. Interestingly, it was destroyed by German bombers in World War II. So there we go. Now, we have to remember that in the period before the First World War, British people treated Germans a bit like we did Poles, not we, but you know they're sort of people who do the sort of jobs Brits don't want to do, and you had a lot of people, Germans, who were waiters at that time, such that during World War One in the trenches, British soldiers used to shout "waiter" across the trenches at the Germans, so obviously calling them out. But what's really interesting as well is that Alois and Bridget had a son, and he was called William Patrick Hitler, obviously with his Irish antecedents. And William Patrick Hitler in the 1930s went to Germany and tried to blackmail Hitler about things that he knew about the family. And Hitler tried to get him a few jobs, but each time William Patrick Hitler didn't like the job he'd been given, and in the end had to leave because he felt under threat. He later became William Stewart Houston in the United States, and believe it or not, served in the United States Navy in the Pacific in World War II.
Wow.
But the issue with Hitler is that Bridget said in a memoir that Adolf Hitler visited his brother, Anton or Alois, in November 1912. And the reason he did that was to dodge being drafted into the Austrian army at the time. But I think the evidence indicates that Alois Anton actually invited some of his family over from Austria to visit him. There's no other evidence. That's the trouble here, James. It's only on the word of his sister-in-law that he was actually there.
So this is maybe one that we'll never fully get to the bottom of.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to Liverpool nowadays, they're quite proud of the fact that Hitler might have visited Toxteth in 1912, 1913, but we can't prove it. It's a nice story, but I think it's really nicely ironic that Luftwaffe destroyed the house in the Second World War.
And you can see why Liverpool would sort of sell this story. It is a great yarn, and it's actually been turned into, I think, a television drama at one point, and there was a novel, wasn't there, as well?
Beryl Bainbridge wrote the novel. You're absolutely right. Yeah, but you know, we're in the realms of fact or fiction here. There's no way of proving it. And as a historian, I always say you always need to back up a single source with another one, and maybe someday it'll come to light.
And do we know if he ever even left Europe? I mean, there is a theory, and we'll come on to this with one of our later myths, that he ended up in South America. But do we have evidence that he ever actually left the continent of Europe?
No, I don't think so. No. So he wasn't that well travelled. He was very well read, of course. He self-taught in many ways, but I don't think he left, no.
Okay, let's move on to myth number 4 about Adolf Hitler. Obviously, we know that Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, 2 days after the invasion of Poland. But should they have done this earlier? Some people think that Britain and France could have taken on Germany in 1938 rather than push for appeasement. Big question this, Chris. What is your take on it?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. Britain and France weren't ready for war in 1938 by their own estimation. Obviously, they had ducked confronting Germany over the reoccupation of the Rhineland earlier. They hadn't done anything about the Anschluss. Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland came up. And as you know, at the time, the French and British consulted and thought, are we going to confront Hitler? Can we afford to do it? It's quite interesting because at that time, we didn't have many Spitfires or Hurricanes. And everybody was a bit windy about taking on a country about whose armed forces we didn't know much about. But what is really quite significant about 1938 is that the German army had made up its mind that if Britain and France had gone to war with Nazi Germany in 1938, there would have been a widespread coup against Hitler and the regime. And that's well documented now, and it's contained in many documents indeed. So the fact that Britain and France didn't even stand up to Germany and say, we're not having it and we're not more robust, means that the Nazi regime continued, went from strength to strength, as we know, up until 1941-42. And it may not have happened if the German army had been able to overthrow Hitler at a time when they wanted to in 1938.
Had he been overthrown in some kind of internal coup in 1938, what kind of regime would have replaced him?
Well, I think initially it would have been a military regime. I think the only way to hold down quite significant populist forces in those days, James, people who really did support Hitler. Remember, he was on the wave of emotion and relief at being able to rise up again as a great power. They would have actually had to hold down the country. I think if you remember at the end of the First World War, the only way they were able to hold it together was by having these Freikorps out on the streets, actually maintaining order through brutal repression. So I think the German army would have had to say, look, we're in charge for a while until we can establish a new constitution, till we can establish order, and so forth. But I think you'd have seen Germany probably partition during that time, and civil war probably would have resulted. And, that was the fear of some of the generals, that actually that would happen. They go back to a sort of civil war period. And there was also the constant threat of what the communists, the socialists would do to a revived Germany. So I think there was a very reasonable fear that if Hitler and the Nazi Party weren't holding it together, then there would be anarchy in Germany. And I think that put a lot of people off. But there was a good plan. They had it in place. And when we remember in July 1944 how close the Operation Valkyrie came to actually being successful, one can see what could have happened in 1938.
I mean, this is fascinating. I mean, this is proper History Undone territory.
Well,
This is what we love doing. We love the alternative history, the counterfactuals. I mean, are you saying that we could have had almost what we had after the Second World War, the partition of Germany, but that could have happened long before then?
Yeah, I think it would have been a de facto partition. I don't think it would have been a de jure, legal partition. But I just think you'd have had parts of Germany saying, "Well, we want to stay Nazi. We don't care what the army's doing." And I think you'd have had civil war, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, how do you think we should look back at the policy of appeasement now, Chris? Clearly, it was a massive strategic failure, but there were many people at the time, and there are some historians who say, look, it was an understandable policy at the time.
Well, I think, I mean, the issue is that you have to. There's some very good books out at the moment. There's one by Tim Bouverie called Appeasement and Rearmament. And you've got to balance your deterrent posture with giving your opponent something. We're in that situation today, James. We are not strong enough to actually take on our opponents if they really overstep the mark. And there's a certain amount of appeasement going on all the time. And I'm afraid to say we need really good people who understand statecraft and deterrence to be able to do this properly. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that appeasement is condemned today, and Churchill famously said, somebody who's an appeaser is somebody who feeds a crocodile in the hope that it will eat him last. And, that's the case. But we view appeasement today through the eyes of what actually happened. There was a war at the end. We don't view it through the eyes of de-escalation. So if a war hadn't happened, appeasement would have been de-escalation to historians. So a lot of these things judged by what happens afterwards. All I can say is that appeasement itself, where you're constantly giving in to an opponent, means that that opponent will constantly take liberties and create new normals, which eventually become insufferable. As Kipling said in relation to the Vikings in his famous poem about Danegeld, he said, look, in the end, you actually have to fight the Danes. It doesn't matter how much you appease them and how much money you give them. If they're going to come after you and keep raising the stakes, then you're going to have to fight them eventually. So make that decision early.
And do you think some of the modern day analogies that are made to appeasement are credible? I mean, the notable one at the moment is people saying that the West for too long has appeased Vladimir Putin in Russia. Do you think that's credible?
Yeah, but until a more credible policy comes along, then you can't really knock what I would call de-escalation. At the moment, James, you and I are living in peace, and that's what we want to continue and prevail in future. You only ever want to go to war when the alternative to war is worse.
Well, let's come on to our fifth and final myth about Adolf Hitler. This is one that I think most people are probably aware of. This is the idea that Hitler did not actually die in that bunker in Berlin in 1945, that he actually escaped it somehow and fled to South America. It's one that never quite disappears fully, Chris. Where does it come from?
There are a couple of themes here. One is the fact that quite a few leading Nazis did escape to South America and, of course, lived in Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, and places like that. So there's an assumption that Hitler might have done that. But all the indications from Hitler, his last testimony, his actions in the bunker say, look, he killed himself. There are so many witnesses, James, saying that he took cyanide, shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide, and so did quite a lot of the rest of the regime, to tell you the truth. I mean, Goebbels and his family, a lot of leading military figures didn't want to survive the regime, and that's entirely consistent with the Darwinian sort of attitude that he had to his own people and himself. And you know, we've got such a good testimony. We know that bits of skull and teeth were held by the Russians. What's really interesting is that the US President Harry Truman actually said to Joseph Stalin, I really need to know what's happened. And Stalin actually said, well, we really don't know, to tell you the truth. We can't confirm whether he's dead. And in fact, the Russians in their propaganda, because they wanted to take over Eastern Europe, spread the narrative that he was still alive and was being protected by the West. So that didn't help. But later on, when obviously we got access to Russian records, it was quite clear that his body was recovered and the bits were taken to Russia. And the indications are that after examination, his ashes were scattered in 1970. But as I say, the piece of skull survived, but that wasn't actually found until 1946, well after the Russians had swept through the Chancellery Garden. But that piece of skull turns out to belonged to a woman between the ages of 20 and 40, as I said, probably one of the people in the bunker at the end.
It is curious how so many of these myths about Hitler start in some way, shape or form from the Russians. Is that purely because they could use it for their own propaganda purposes?
Yeah, as we said at the beginning, James, I mean, everybody uses Hitler and any other historical figure, whether it's King Arthur or Henry VIII, for their own purposes. And Hitler was no different in that respect. I mean, what's quite interesting is that two of Hitler's valets were actually kept by the NKVD and interrogated quite severely, because Stalin was intimately interested in every detail of Hitler's life. It's like, one dictator looking at another one and saying, are we alike or are we different? And I think that's part of this, to tell you the truth. But yeah, it's people's agendas, it's people's different sort of ways in which they want to go through things.
Had he somehow managed to escape the bunker and flee to South America, how long do you think he would have lasted, Chris? Because, of course, people like Eichmann and Mengele did eventually get found.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think it'd be very difficult. It depends when you went. I mean, quite a lot of people didn't get out of the bunker. If you follow how Martin Bormann, his basically his closest sort of official escaped, he ended up getting killed en route. And if you track some of the leading Nazis who escaped from the bunker, very few of them actually make it out of the encircling Russian grip. So I don't think he'd have made it. You couldn't have dragged your women along with you as well. The only way out was actually through routes, frankly, that were still open when the Russians were sort of concentrating on getting to the bunker itself. And we mustn't forget that Hitler was pretty much an invalid by then anyway. He had symptoms of Parkinson's disease. He was heavily laden with various drugs, including oxycodone, methamphetamine, morphine, and even cocaine. So, he was a complete invalid by the end. So the idea that he might have escaped and escaped recognition is ridiculous. Let's also remember that Himmler tried to escape by pretending to be a seaman in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and he got caught and recognized straight away. So very difficult indeed. And I'm also not sure how Hitler, as a teetotaler, a non-smoker and a vegetarian, would have survived, given what was going on.
And not to be too glib, he probably would have had to have lost his moustache if he was going to avoid detection.
Well, I don't know. There were quite a few people around sporting moustaches like that at the time. I remember Charlie Chaplin had one.
True. So not so many these days.
So maybe at the time, he'd have fitted into the crowd. But no, look, he didn't escape the Chancellery. But more importantly, James, nor did he want to. He saw this as a twilight of the gods. This was classic Germanic sort of mythology. And he thought by going down like that, people would remember him. Well, as we do.
Well, there we go. 5 big myths about Adolf Hitler, comprehensively busted. Great work, Chris. Before we go, do you want to leave us with a fact about Adolf Hitler that maybe people aren't so aware of?
Well, I'll give you a couple. By the end of his life, he was worth about $5 billion in terms of his personal fortune, which he got obviously from donations, obviously subsidies from various corporations, but also from his book writing. I mean, Mein Kampf was an amazing bestseller because people used to give them as sort of wedding gifts to newlyweds and to visiting dignitaries and things like that. The other thing is he didn't pay income tax, so he was quite rich. Now, the second fact I want to give you is that in 1939, a member of the Swedish Parliament nominated Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, although he intended it as a joke, it actually went through the system. In 1936, a German journalist, Karl von Ossietzky, he was a vocal critic of Hitler, had been named the winner of the 1935 Peace Prize. And this gesture was seen as a censure of Nazism and an insult to Germany. And as a result, Hitler banned all Germans from accepting Nobel Prizes and created the German National Prize for Art and Science as an alternative. And 3 Germans who subsequently won Nobel Prizes during the Third Reich were forced to decline their awards, but they later received the diplomas, medals, and the money associated with it. But the fact that Hitler should be nominated at all for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1939 is quite remarkable.
I mean, that is. I never knew that. I mean, some people raised eyebrows when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think
Barack Obama.
Adolf Hitler won it, or that probably would have put an end to it.
Yeah. But there we go. But Barack Obama as well, for not being George Bush. Quite extraordinary.
Yes, indeed. Dr. Chris Parry, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will be back very soon, busting more historical myths. If there's anything you would like to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.